Joining us now is member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger of Illinois. He's an Air Force veteran and currently a major in the Air National Guard. And I understand you were surprised by this decision as well and don't agree with it. What are you hoping for from the White House, from cabinet officials who may vehemently disagree with this as well?
You know, I've said the president's got a right to make the decision. I'm not questioning that, but this is a really bad decision. And if I'm a cabinet official and I think every one of them had their advice disregarded or not asked, I'd be pretty furious about it. I mean, this is a big deal, and it seems like the president, you know, this bromance with Rand Paul that just got completed somehow. They played golf enough, and Rand, with his very out there foreign policy that's actually libertarian and has nothing to do with republicanism but is masquerading as a Republican, somehow got in the president's ear. And instead of the president going in front of his foreign policy team that actually knows this stuff, he just says, hey, it's done, we're going to do it, we're going to pull everybody out. Rand's excited, you know, Laura Ingram's excited, but the rest of people that actually understand how the world works and how the fact that 2,200 soldiers is a relatively small investment to continue to destroy ISIS and keep them at bay, the rest of us are pretty confused.
Hey, Congressman, one of the elements of this decision, other than announcing it by tweet, was a video that the President of the United States cut, announcing that you know, we've done this wonderful thing, and everyone who is sacrificed, everyone who has fallen on the field of battle over there is thrilled with my decision, his decision, the president's. I was wondering, A, if you've seen the video, and B, what was your reaction?
I was offended. I was almost trembling after I saw it. I don't know if he intended this to be the case. So I don't want to say he came out there with, but I wear on my wrist, it's a buddy of mine that I actually flew with in Iraq in '08, and he had been, you know, continually going back and was actually killed in Iraq in 2018. His name's Captain Andreas O'Keefe. And I don't think the president, as much as he may think so, can speak for Captain O'Keefe in terms of whether he wants to continue to prosecute the war against terror or not. I think when somebody gives their life for the country, let's respect that and not drag them into the politics of whether fighting ISIS is wrong or right. Again, the president has a right to make this decision. I would have said he has the right even if it was President Obama. But I have the right and the responsibility to say this is poor, this is a bad decision.
Will you pressure him, will you and members of the House and the members of the like-minded members of the Senate pressure him to change his mind? He's changed his mind before.
I've been trying to pressure ever since this all came out yesterday morning. In terms of legislation, there's not much we can do. It's really just kind of a decision by the president.
Do you think there's any chance that he'll change his mind?
I don't know. Probably not. I mean, maybe. It depends if Rand Paul talks to him after his, I mean, it depends how that cycle goes. What
are you talking about? Rand Paul? I mean, are you really, you're not really, because he attacks Rand Paul all the time. He calls him weak. Are you really saying that Rand Paul is running U.S. foreign policy right now?
I don't think he's running U.S. foreign policy, but for whatever reason, he got into the president's ear. And I think that is an impetus, because otherwise, I don't know what happened. I mean, literally, the president woke up and I don't know what happened. Rand is celebrating.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying, and it's sort of who is in his face at the moment who triggers him to do something. That might be the concern that has happened.
Well, maybe Lindsey Graham needs to go golfing with him today then.
No, here's the bigger question, and I'll pose it to Adam, but also to the table. At what point are members of this administration concerned that a snap decision like this was made and can be made again and can damage not only our place in the world, but put lives in danger? Because this seems like an incredibly snap decision, and we've seen this before from this president.
Well, they are concerned, so the question is,
what do you do?
Should Pompeo continue at State? Should Mattis continue at the DOD? If this president will send 6,000 troops to the border to fight an imaginary
in a snap
enemy
decision
and take out 2,000 troops that are actually holding Iran, Syria, ISIS, and Russia in check?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one for me to answer. I'd be concerned, especially if I'm sitting in the administration and I wasn't asked about it, or my opinion was disregarded, or I see a repeat of what we were so argumentative in 2011 was going to happen when we left Iraq. That's actually part of the reason I ran for Congress, because I knew that we were going to withdraw from Iraq too early. we're just like repeating this mistake again.
Hey, Congressman, it's Willie Geist. I want to read you a quote that just came across within the hour from Vladimir Putin at a press conference. He was asked about this decision by the President of the United States. First asked about the President's declaration that ISIS has been defeated. President Putin said, quote, "Donald is right, and I agree with him." Then asked about the pledge to withdraw U.S. troops in Syria. He said, "It's the right thing to do." What is your reaction to Putin's reaction to Donald Trump?
Well, I mean, it's amazing. I think next, we may as well pull out of Ukraine and, call Georgia, Ukraine, and NATO enemies. And then I think, Russia will praise us even more for that. I think it's obvious. Look, the Russians wanted us to leave. They want the Middle East. If they think ISIS is defeated, then they're obviously feeding into this so that the president believes it. I mean, it's, what is there to say? It kind of speaks for itself. Putin's not our friend.
Congressman Adam Kinzinger, thank you very much.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.